Since it first burst onto our screens in 2013, Rick and Morty has spawned more fan theories than just about any other show. And for good reason. There are literally infinite possible outcomes for any scenario on the show, and the creators love to blow our minds by exploring the wildest ones. But this particular theory that suggests that Rick and Morty might actually be the same person might just make all the others look like a pile of schleem. Oh yeah, you heard right. This theory actually wonders if Rick and his grandson Morty are really the same person. But wait a second, how is it possible for someone to simultaneously be their grandson and grandfather? Well, just like watching Rick and Morty, it requires you to suspend your disbelief for a few moments and trust that it will all make sense in the end. Kind of. So here we go. The show has been very clear about deciding not to delve into all that tricky time travel business. It never really works out well and always leaves audiences with more questions than answers. As much as we love Back to the Future, it's impossible to ignore that there are some pretty glaring inconsistencies. Sorry, but how would George and Lorraine not notice that their son literally grew into the exact person who they spent a ton of time with at the end of high school, and that Lorraine even tried to make out with him in her car? Sure, it was a while ago, but we remember the faces of people who were a big part of our lives as teenagers, don't you? Come on, George would at least be a little suspicious if anything. Okay, so we got sidetracked, but it's a good point and exactly why Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland have directly avoided getting into all this messy time travel business on Rick and Morty. And yet, there is very clearly a box marked time travel stuff in Rick's garage. So chances are, even if he avoids it now, preferring instead to stick to some regular old dimension hopping, Rick has dipped his toe into time travel at some point in the past. Or is it the future? Oh no, it's already started. Taking that mysterious box into account, this theory believes that Rick did travel through time, but only once. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. This theory goes back. Way back. All the way back to that day that Rick abandoned his young daughter Beth. Now, we know that there are some inconsistencies in this plot point based off of flashbacks of Rick holding a baby Morty and yada yada yada, but for the sake of this theory, let's go with the stated fact that Rick abandoned Beth 20 years before the start of the show and only recently reappeared in her life. And for this theory, let's imagine that Rick never came back, so after Beth had Summer and then Morty grew up never having known his grandfather. We all know that when Rick dropped back into the Smiths' lives, he changed Morty's life forever. But if Morty had never known Rick, he simply would have grown up in a pretty unhappy household. With his biggest male influence being Jerry, he might have developed the same traits as his underachieving father. His inability to hold down a job, his lack of confidence, his meekness, and his total inability to sustain a healthy relationship. Along with that, he would also be heavily influenced by Beth's detachment and distance and his big sister's disinterest. All of this would leave our poor Rickless Morty with a veritable cornucopia of insecurities and drawbacks, growing up in a pretty miserable environment with a total lack of any kind of nurturing. Because of this, Morty would have nowhere to turn except to movies, TV, and books. He might have even gotten super into science fiction, looking towards worlds and realities so far beyond his own for hope of something better. So let's say that this Morty did get super into sci-fi. Well, like lots of fans of the genre, his interest in it might have grown into a desire to learn as much about real science as he possibly could, to the point that it became an obsession. But there was one person who still stood in the way, just a little bit. And that person is, of course, Jessica. For this theory to work, we have to believe that at some point, Morty was able to woo Jessica and the two would wind up in a relationship, possibly after finding love together in the annual flu season dance. Now we fast forward a few years until Morty is an adult and in a committed relationship with the girl he always yearned for. But because Morty's only example of a relationship is that of his parents, he quickly sets about self-sabotaging his chances for happiness, just like his dad did. This version of Morty gets more and more miserable, experiences failure upon failure, and eventually turns to alcohol for escape. He and Jessica are now fighting all the time, with Morty taking her for granted and blaming her for his shortcomings just like Beth did to Jerry. And just like Beth, he'd begin to wish that he had never met Jessica, let alone got into a relationship with her. Look, we know things are dark now, but hang in there. They're about to get even darker. So one day, everything comes crashing down around poor Morty. He loses his job because of his drinking problem, and Jessica leaves him because she can't handle his self-destructive ways. This is the final straw, and now, at his lowest point, is the moment where Morty decides to totally reinvent himself. While he is a total emotional mess, all of his interest in science and science fiction has actually turned Morty into something of a genius scientist. At some point, he stumbles upon the method of opening a portal to another dimension. At this point, the old Morty is gone, and he dedicates years and years of his life to trying to figure out how to make things right again. In the meantime, he has come to lay all the blame on his father for everything that has gone wrong in his life. This blame turns into outright hatred, and he decides he must find a way to interfere with his father's influence on his young mind. Mad scientist Morty now decides that the only way to do this is to go back in time in order to step in and undermine Jerry's influence on his young self and stop himself from ever getting together with Jessica in the process in order to fix his future. He also needs to teach his younger self how to stand up for himself more and help him develop a backbone of his own. The only way that this Morty can think of doing this is by interfering in the relationship he had with his parents and showing him the cold, harsh reality of the universe in the meantime. But how? Well, in all of his dimension hopping, remember years and years have gone by at this point, Morty has stumbled across a dimension in which time travel is possible and accessible. He steals the necessary equipment from said dimension and brings it back to his own. Finally, Morty time travels all the way back to when he was a young boy and, in order to infiltrate the family, impersonates the grandfather that he never knew, the man who had abandoned his daughter when he was only a child, Rick. Since Beth hasn't seen her father since she was very young, and now that Morty is an elderly man, she assumes that he is who he says he is and welcomes him back to the family with open arms. Now his real plan can begin. Morty, now Rick, sets about aligning himself with the younger version of himself and pushing out Jerry in the meantime. He takes Morty on grand adventures across the universe, opening his mind to all the possibilities that science has to offer while undercutting Jerry's influence any chance he can get. While Jerry may seem relatively harmless to us, Morty, aka Rick, knows the truth about how damaging his influence can be, which is why he is so insanely hard on Jerry, who looks to the outside viewer like he's just too dumb for his own good. As well as pulling Morty out of Jerry's grasp, the new Rick also makes a point to sabotage Morty's crush on Jessica at any chance he can get, which isn't too difficult seeing as how Morty was never very popular to begin with. It also happens that all of that precious time travel equipment that he stole in order to make this plan happen in the first place was actually lifted from the Galactic Federation, which has left him a criminal in their eyes ever since. Because he couldn't have the Federation tracking him down and revealing his biggest secret to the Smith family, Morty Rick was finally able to completely dismantle the organization in the episode The Rickshank Redemption with the simple changing of a 1 to a 0, keeping his identity safe forever. But what about all the other Ricks and Mortys, you might be asking yourself by now? Well, that can be explained by the fact that this has happened to every Morty in every timeline in every universe across the central finite curve. Every Rick is actually a grown-up Morty, and they are all simply keeping each other's secrets for the good of all the Mortys that exist. While this is still just a theory, it does actually explain a lot about the similarities between Rick and Morty. Take their speech. Both Rick and Morty share very similar speech patterns, like stuttering and circle talking. Sure, Morty doesn't burp every other word like Rick does, but that's just because he doesn't have the years and years of alcohol abuse that Rick does that probably caused that problem in the first place. Given some time, he'll probably develop that too. In the Rickshank Redemption, during the fake flashback, we also see young Rick wearing blue jeans. Who else wears blue jeans on the show? Why, Morty, of course. That could have been something that the Morty turned Rick changed up before he time traveled back in order to not raise suspicion. Sure, more than one person in the world is allowed to wear jeans, but Rick is a diligent man and would make sure to cover every base he could think of. We even have evidence that he might have encountered a Morty in the process of becoming a Rick in the background in the episode Close Encounters of the Rick Kind. When Rick and Morty visit the Citadel of Ricks, there's a Rick walking around who has a distinctly Morty-like face. If we go with the idea that all Ricks who exist are Mortys in the future, then this is just one who hasn't quite aged enough to make it back to his family yet. And he doesn't have a Morty with him. Even more evidence that he's still transitioning from his Morty past to his Rick future. He's even wearing jeans. But if Rick was actually Morty, why would he be so incredibly mean to his younger self, who he came back to save? Well, a Rick is still a Rick, even if he's a Morty. Wait, what? Let's think of it this way. He may have started out a Morty, but the self-loathing he has built up over his life is very real. He hates himself, and thereby hates Morty. Well, he hates everyone. Plus, he's annoyed by the fact that he has to hang out with the teenage version of himself all the time. Wouldn't you be? This might be a completely ridiculous theory, but what is Rick and Morty if not ridiculous? Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland have created a multiverse in which almost anything is possible. So why is it too crazy to believe in the possibility of a Morty who is actually the Rickest Rick and the Mortiest Morty all at once? Until the show wraps its final episode, there is nothing, and we mean nothing, about Rick and Morty that is impossible. And that's the way the news goes. Whew, that was a doozy. So what did you think of this crazy theory? Do you believe it could be possible? Or does it just not make enough sense for you? Do you have any theories that might blow this one out of the water? Let us know in the comments, and we hope you had fun watching this video.